No words, no warnings. Humanity just left. The seat was empty. Not just empty the way a seat gets empty when someone steps out to use the facilities or grabs a drink from the corridor. It was empty the way a room feels empty after something important has been taken out of it. The kind of empty that has weight to it. I noticed it before the session even began. Council Chamber 7 of the Galactic Conclave was already buzzing with the usual noise. The low harmonic chatter of the Velkar delegation. The clicking of the Drovan scribes logging every whispered word. The faint chemical signals drifting from the Pahrine ambassadors that my translator unit told me expressed mild impatience. All of it perfectly normal. All of it exactly as it had been for the past 11 years that I had served as a junior diplomatic observer for the Sci-Fi Commonwealth. But the human seat was empty. I am called Orin. That is the closest approximation of my designation that a human tongue could have managed. And since humans were the ones who taught this station's translation systems to assign us pronounceable names, the label stuck. I am Sethi. We are a long-lived, careful people. We do not rush. We do not gamble. We observe, we record, and we act only when we are certain. In 11 years at the Conclave, I had built a quiet reputation as someone who noticed things. Small things. The kind of things other observers missed, because they were too busy watching the big, obvious movements to catch the subtle ones. I noticed the empty seat. I checked my data pad. The human delegation was listed as active and present. Ambassador Colin Marsh had checked into his quarters 2 nights ago. His second, a sharp-eyed woman named Faye Denton, had eaten in the station's shared dining hall just yesterday morning according to the automated meal logs. Their support staff, 4 humans in total, had all been accounted for as recently as 18 hours ago. And yet, empty seat. I leaned toward my colleague Sessa, who had been observing conclave proceedings for 30 years longer than I had, and who had developed the kind of calm that comes from having seen everything at least twice. The humans, I said quietly, they have not arrived. Sessa did not look up from her notes. They are always late, she said. It is practically a cultural tradition for them. That was fair. In my 11 years, I could count on 2 hands the number of times the human delegation had arrived on time to a scheduled session. They were famously, almost professionally, tardy. Once, Ambassador Marsh had shown up 40 minutes into a session, eating a meal he had apparently just cooked himself, offered no explanation, and proceeded to ask the most pointed and relevant questions of the entire debate. The conclave had been furious and impressed in equal measure. So I waited. The session opened. The agenda began moving through its first items. A trade dispute between the Cathali Compact and the outer mining settlements, a proposed amendment to interstellar salvage law, a routine update on boundary markers near the Yesen Drift. Normal. Procedural. The kind of session where nothing significant would happen, and everyone knew it. 40 minutes passed. The human seat remained empty. An hour. Still empty. I watched the other delegations. Most were not watching the empty seat. They were watching their own notes, their own devices, their own quiet political calculations. But a few had noticed. The Velkar senior ambassador, a towering creature named Dasik whose 4 eyes moved independently of each other, had 2 of those eyes resting on the human chair with an expression that my translation unit flagged as guarded curiosity. The Pahrine chemical signals had shifted to something my unit described, with some hesitation, as mild unease. When the session closed without the human delegation having appeared at all, the murmurs in the chamber were mostly dismissive. I heard fragments as people filed out. Typical human behavior. Perhaps they have had some internal dispute. Their politics are always in some state of chaos. Maybe they are making a statement about the salvage law amendment. They did object to it last session. I did not say anything. I walked back to my assigned workspace, sat down in front of my communication terminal, and sent a direct contact request to Ambassador Colin Marsh. The channel connected immediately. It did not go to a waiting queue or a message system. The line was simply open. No one answered. I sat listening to the open silence of an active channel for nearly a minute before closing it. Then I tried Faye Denton's personal frequency. Same result. Open channel. Silence. I tried the General Human Delegation comm address. Open. Silent. I tried the Human Diplomatic Mission's public contact relay. Open. Silent. None of the lines were blocked. None of them were closed or routed to an automated response. They were all simply open and unanswered, like doors that had been left unlocked but led into rooms where no one was home. That night I filed a preliminary observation note, a routine procedural document that went into the conclave's monitoring system and would be read by perhaps 3 people, none of them urgently. I noted the absence of the human delegation, the non-response on all contact channels, and flagged it as requiring a follow-up check within the next standard day. I worded it carefully, as I always did. I did not use words like alarming or unusual. I used words like noteworthy and pending clarification. Then I went to my quarters and spent a long time looking at the ceiling, which is something I do when my mind will not be quiet. The next morning I arrived at the monitoring center early and pulled the routine galactic signal traffic report. The conclave's long-range relay network was always busy, thousands of signals passing through every hour, shipping reports, diplomatic updates, scientific telemetry, commercial traffic. I was not looking for anything specific. I was just looking, the way I always did, waiting for something small to catch my attention. What caught my attention was not small. 37 human colony systems had gone quiet. Not gradually, not one by one over the course of weeks, in a way that might suggest a spreading technical fault. All 37 simultaneously, within a window of less than 6 standard hours, at some point between 2 nights ago and this morning. I read the report 3 times. Then I pulled the individual system logs and read those. Every human world, every station, every deep space relay, every navigation beacon inside human-designated space had simply stopped transmitting. The signals had not been jammed. They had not been scrambled or cut at the relay points. The monitoring network showed no interference, no competing signal, no technical anomaly that could explain a simultaneous blackout across 37 separate systems. The signals had simply stopped because the sources had chosen to stop sending them. I sat with that thought for a very long time. Then I went to find Sessa. I found her in the observation lounge on the station's upper ring, drinking her morning tea and watching a transport freighter make its slow approach to Docking Bay 4. I sat down across from her without being invited, which was unusual enough that she looked up at me immediately. "Tell me something," I said. "In 30 years of observing the conclave, have you ever known humans to go quiet?" She set down her tea. She looked at me with an expression that I had learned over the years meant she was deciding how seriously to take what I had just said. Then she said, "No. Not once?" "Not once," she said. "Even when they were angry. Even when they had decided to boycott a vote or withdraw from a committee. They always made noise about it. They always sent messages, made declarations, issued statements. They are the loudest species in the conclave by a significant margin." She paused. "Why?" I told her what I had found. She did not say anything for a long moment. She picked up her tea, looked into it as though the answer might be floating somewhere in its surface, and then set it down again without drinking. "All 37?" she said. "All 37, within the same 6-hour window." She was quiet again. Outside the window, the freighter was still slowly making its way toward the dock, patient and heavy and oblivious. "That is not a technical fault," she said. "No," I said, "it is not." "And the delegation here?" "Open channels. No response. The station's internal sensors show their quarters as occupied, but do not detect life signs consistent with active presence." I had checked that too, first thing this morning. The quarters showed the trace warmth and residual chemical markers of recent habitation, but no one home. Beds that had been slept in, a half-finished book left open on a reading table, a jacket draped over a chair. Sessa looked at me for a long moment. "File a formal inquiry," she said quietly. "Not a preliminary observation. A formal inquiry. Use the correct language." I nodded and stood to leave. "Oren," she said. I stopped. "Do not use the word alarming in the filing," she said. "Use the word significant." I understood what she meant. Alarming would bring attention of the wrong kind. Political attention, reactive attention, the kind that made people start talking before they started thinking. Significant would bring the right people to the right table in the right order. I filed the inquiry. Then I went back to my workspace, pulled up every piece of data I had access to regarding human communication patterns, human colony network architecture, and the history of human signals in the conclave relay system. I worked through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. I barely noticed the hours passing. I was looking for something, some pattern, some precursor signal, some small thing I had missed. And the longer I looked, the more certain I became that whatever had not happened suddenly. Whatever this was, it had been coming for a long time. I just could not yet see the shape of it. By late afternoon, the formal inquiry had been logged, processed, and flagged to the conclave's diplomatic monitoring division. By evening, 3 other delegations had independently noticed the human silence and filed their own queries. By the time I finally left my workspace, the station was beginning to hum with the specific frequency of an institution that has registered that something is wrong, but has not yet decided how wrong. I walked the long corridor back to my quarters slowly, the way I do when I need my thoughts to settle. Humans never go quiet. That was what Sessa had said, and she was right. In 11 years I had watched them argue, negotiate, walk out, come back, lecture, joke, challenge, and occasionally say things in the middle of formal sessions that made the translation units pause in apparent confusion. They were loud, they were present, they filled whatever room they were in with a kind of restless energy that was, depending on your perspective, either exhausting or interesting. The seat had been empty. Not because of a dispute, not because of a boycott, not because of a late breakfast or a political calculation. They had simply not come. And across 37 star systems, across every world and station and relay point they had ever built or claimed or occupied in this galaxy, they had, at some agreed-upon moment, chosen to stop speaking. I reached my quarters and sat down on the edge of my sleeping surface without turning on the lights. I sat in the dark for a while, thinking about open channels and empty chairs and the particular quality of a silence that does not feel like absence. It feels like decision. I had spent 11 years learning to notice small things. And the thing I was noticing now, sitting in the dark in my quarters on a station that was slowly beginning to understand that something enormous had happened, was this. Humans do not go quiet by accident. They go quiet when they have made up their minds. The first probe we sent to human space came back with footage that I have watched more times than I can count, and every single time I watch it, I feel the same thing. Not fear exactly. Not grief exactly. Something that sits between the two and does not have a clean name in any language I know. The probe entered the Varan system, the closest human colony to Conclave Central Station, a mid-sized world called Ardennes that had been home to roughly 400,000 humans, and transmitted live footage for 6 uninterrupted hours before we recalled it. Ardennes was intact. That was the first thing. That was the thing that hit hardest, actually. Because none of us had said it out loud, but everyone in the monitoring room had been quietly bracing for the alternative, for wreckage, for the kind of catastrophic event that could silence 37 systems at once. We had been expecting to find something terrible. We did not find something terrible. We found something far stranger. The city of Port Caro, Ardennes' largest settlement, appeared on our screens exactly as it had looked in the last archived survey footage. Neat streets lined with the low, wide buildings humans preferred, public green spaces where automated irrigation systems were still running on schedule, a transit network that was still cycling through its routes on time, even though no passengers were waiting at any stop. The lights were on. The power grid was fully active. Atmospheric processors hummed along at their normal settings. In the harbor district, boats were still moored and gently rocking with the tide. My colleague Preth, who handled our technical analysis, kept cycling through different sensor readings as if expecting the next one to reveal the catastrophe that the visual feed was hiding. He checked atmospheric composition. Normal. Structural integrity of major buildings. Normal. Soil contamination levels. Normal. Biological hazard indicators. Normal. There is no event signature, he said, with the careful tone of a person who is trying very hard not to sound as confused as they are. Nothing that would indicate a reason for evacuation. No seismic event, no atmospheric failure, no pathogen bloom, no radiation spike, nothing. Not an evacuation, I said. He looked at me. A departure, I said. Those are different things. He was quiet for a moment, then he returned to his screens. I was right about the difference, and as more probe data came in from more systems over the following 2 days, The distinction became impossible to ignore. An evacuation leaves mess. It leaves panic behind it. Dropped belongings, overturned furniture, vehicles abandoned mid-route, queues of people frozen in the evidence of their rush to leave. Every major evacuation in galactic history, from the Velkar coastal floods to the Drovan volcanic crisis, had produced the same visual signature of organized chaos. What we found in human space looked nothing like that. We found a kitchen in a residential building in Port Caro where a meal had been prepared, plated, and left on a table. 4 plates, 4 chairs. The food had long since dried out and grown cold, but it was still on the plates, still arranged in the way someone had intended it to look when it was first set down. My translation of the food composition was a simple family dinner: bread, some kind of protein, vegetables cooked in a sauce that my analysis unit estimated had taken several hours to prepare. Whoever had made that meal had sat down at that table, and then gotten up and left the food sitting there. On a school campus in the settlement of Kellen's Fork, a smaller community further inland, automated cleaning systems had kept the classrooms spotless. On every desk in the first room our probe camera panned through. There was a small object. My sensor unit identified them as handmade items: paper, folded into geometric shapes the way humans sometimes did with their hands when they were thinking or explaining something. Every desk had one. They were all slightly different from each other. Someone had taken time to make them and leave them there. I have thought about those paper shapes more than I should have. The probe footage from the space stations was perhaps the most striking. Human orbital facilities above Ardennes showed the same pattern: powered, functional, empty. In the main docking bay of Ardennes Station, 7 ships were docked with full fuel loads. Not the small automated cargo haulers that ran without crew, but the larger transit vessels that required human pilots. They were fueled. Their systems were in standby, and they were going nowhere. That was when I started to understand, slowly, and with the particular discomfort of a realization you were not looking for and do not entirely want. They had not fled. They had not been chased. They had not needed ships to leave, which meant they had left by some other means, or they had taken only specific ships and left these behind on purpose. On the 3rd day after the probes were deployed, I finally got authorization to travel to Ardennes myself. The Conclave's monitoring division had been reluctant. Protocol required confirmed safety before sending observers, but the probe data had satisfied their requirements, and I had been persistent in a quiet way that I had learned over the years was more effective than being loud about it. I took a shuttle from the station with a team of 4, Preth for technical analysis, a xenosociologist named Dava who studied human cultural patterns, a medical observer named Kos, and my assistant, a young Sethii named Kel who had been with me for 2 years, and who had the excellent quality of being able to stay quiet when quiet was what the situation needed. We landed at Port Caro's main transit depot, which our probes had confirmed was clear and structurally sound. The ramp descended, and I was the first one down it, stepping onto human ground for the first time in my career. The air was clean. A light wind moved through the streets. Somewhere in the distance, an automated sprinkler system in a public garden clicked on and began running. We walked. The silence was different from what I had expected. I had expected the silence of abandonment, the heavy, accumulated stillness of a place where nothing had lived for a long time. Instead, the silence felt recent. It felt like the silence of a room where people have just stepped out, where the warmth of their presence is still faintly in the air, where you half expect to hear a door open and footsteps returning. Dava was the one who pointed out the personal items. As we walked through a residential district, she noted them aloud in her recorder: a pair of shoes by a door, clean and recently polished; a child's drawing fixed to a window with adhesive tape, colorful and unfinished, the crayon still out on the table below it; a small collection of hand-carved wooden figures on a shelf, visible through a ground-level window. Things that had value because someone had made them or cherished them, left behind precisely, not carelessly. They chose what to take, Dava said quietly into her recorder, and they chose what to leave. Kos confirmed by the 2nd day that there was no biological trace of illness, no chemical residue of any harmful agent, nothing in the environment that posed any risk to us, or that could have posed a risk to the humans who had lived here. Whatever they had left because of, it was not something that had driven them out. It was something that had drawn them away. On the second day of our survey, I went to the Human Diplomatic Mission's local office in Port Caro, a modest building near the city's administrative center that served as the conclave's liaison point for Ardennes. I had been saving this for last. I was not sure why. Something in me wanted to walk the streets first, to see the city before I saw the office. The mission building was unlocked. Everything in it was in order. Files stored, equipment shut down properly, furniture arranged neatly. In the main meeting room, the conference table had been cleared except for one item. On the chair at the head of the table, the chair that would have been used by the mission's senior representative, there was a small data chip. Standard human format. No label on the casing. No external markings of any kind. I picked it up carefully and turned it over in my hands. Kel, standing in the doorway, watched me. "What is it?" "I do not know yet," I said. "We had the chip analyzed before I accessed it personally. It was clean. No embedded hazards. No encryption beyond a standard one-use read lock that our equipment opened easily. When I finally loaded it into a display unit back on our shuttle, it showed nothing except a string of coordinates. Not human space coordinates. Not any mapped region of the galaxy. A location beyond the outermost edges of the conclave's charted territory, in a direction that our deep space surveys had marked decades ago as empty and unremarkable, and had never looked at closely enough to say more than that. I copied the coordinates carefully, and sat with them for a long time. That evening, Dava came to find me where I was sitting in the shuttle's observation bubble, looking out at Port Caro's lights, which were all still on, all still running on schedule, faithfully keeping the city illuminated for residents who would not come home. She sat down across from me and pulled up her own research on her datapad. "I have been going through the conclave's trade and cultural exchange records," she said, "everything involving human activity for the past 60 years. And?" I said. She turned the pad toward me. On the screen was a visualization of human trade routes, not the official designated shipping lanes, but the actual movement patterns of human vessels as logged by relay buoys and checkpoint stations. It looked like a web, a vast, deliberately constructed web that spread from human space outward in specific directions. They were not trading, Dava said. Or rather, they were trading. But the trade was not the point. Look at where the routes go. I looked. The routes went outward, toward the galactic rim, toward empty space. "Prepositioning," I said softly. "Supplies, equipment, materials that you would need if you were planning to travel somewhere far away and sustain yourself when you got there." She paused. "For 60 years. This pattern goes back 60 years, Oren. Before I was assigned to human studies. Before your career started. This has been happening for 60 years, and we logged every single ship movement, and no one ever looked at the whole picture at once." I looked at the web on her screen for a long time. Then I looked back out at the city with its faithful lights and its empty streets and its sprinkler systems clicking on in the public gardens. They had been planning this for 60 years. Every trade negotiation, every diplomatic session, every cultural exchange program and scientific conference and joint research project, all of it happening while somewhere else, quietly and consistently, human ships were moving supplies toward the edge of the galaxy. Not urgently, not secretly in a way that required hiding. Just steadily. Just the way you move things when you have a plan, and you are patient enough to see it through. "They knew," I said. It was not really a statement. It came out more like something coming loose inside me. "Knew what?" Kel asked from his seat nearby. He had been listening quietly the whole time. "They knew they were going to leave," I said. "They had always known. They just did not know exactly when." I paused. Or perhaps they did know. Perhaps the timing was part of the plan too. The city's lights held steady outside the window. The sprinklers clicked off. In the silence, I thought about 60 years of quiet, patient, unremarked upon preparation. I thought about every human who had sat in a conclave session and asked uncomfortable questions, and been dismissed as eccentric or difficult or simply strange. I thought about how every time a human had said something that made the translation units pause, we had assumed they were being imprecise with language. Maybe they had been precise. Maybe they had been saying exactly what they meant. Maybe we had just never been listening carefully enough. I held the data chip with its string of coordinates and thought about where they pointed. Beyond the mapped edge. into the space we had marked unremarkable and moved on from. The space humans, apparently, had not moved on from. The space humans had decided was worth a closer look. I have a very specific memory of the first time I met a human in a professional capacity. It was during my second year as a conclave observer, at a joint research symposium on deep space navigation, the kind of event that sounds important on a program, but mostly consists of specialists talking at each other for 3 days, without anyone changing their mind about anything. The human at that symposium was a cartographer named Owen Lyle. He was not a senior diplomat or a prominent figure of any kind. He was, by human professional standards, a mid-level specialist in stellar mapping who had been invited to present a paper on gravitational drift calculations in the Outer Rim territories. He was quiet during the general sessions, sat in the back, asked one brief question that everyone else seemed to find slightly beside the point. On the last evening of the symposium, I found him in the corridor outside the presentation hall, standing in front of a wall display that showed the standard conclave map of known galactic territory, the enormous, intricate chart of every charted star, system, and region that the combined civilizations of the conclave had surveyed and catalogued over thousands of years of shared history. He was looking at the edges, not the mapped parts, the white space at the borders where the surveys ran out, and the notation simply read, unknown or unsurveyed. I stopped beside him. I do not know why. I am not naturally a person who starts conversations, but something about the way he was looking at that white space made me stop. Is there something specific you are looking for? I asked. He turned to look at me, and he had that expression that I would later come to recognize as characteristic of humans engaged in serious thought, slightly unfocused, as though part of their attention was still inside whatever they had been considering. Then he focused on me fully and said, "Not looking. Just noticing." "Noticing what?" He gestured at the map. "How much of it is still blank?" he said. "We have been out here for thousands of years, all these civilizations, and look how much is still blank." I looked at the map. The blank areas were significant. I suppose I had always known that. But it was the kind of knowledge that lives in the background. You know it without really thinking about it. "The surveys take time," I said. "The distances are significant." "Yes," he said. He looked at the map for another moment. Then he said, with a perfectly ordinary tone, as if he were commenting on the quality of the food at the symposium, "Does it not make you wonder what is out there?" I said something polite and non-committal, as I always did when a conversation moved into territory I was not sure how to navigate. He nodded, smiled slightly, and walked away. And I thought nothing more of it. I thought about Owen Lyle a great deal now. Dava's research had opened a door that I could not close again, and for the 2 weeks following our return from Ardennes, I did almost nothing except walk through it. I requested access to 60 years of archived conclave records, trade logs, diplomatic exchange records, cultural program documentation, scientific conference proceedings, joint research publications, and anything else that had involved human participation during that time. It was an enormous amount of material. I did not try to read all of it. I looked for patterns. And the patterns were everywhere. The trading routes Dava had identified were only the most visible layer. Below that were other movements, other quiet, consistent behaviors that had been happening for decades without anyone thinking to connect them. Human delegates had, over 60 years, requested and received copies of every galactic map, stellar survey, and navigation chart in the conclave's shared scientific archive. They had done this through normal channels, formal requests, properly filed, properly granted, noted in the archive's access logs in the way that thousands of other routine document requests were noted. Nobody had flagged it, because there was nothing technically wrong with it. Member civilizations had the right to request copies of shared scientific materials. Humans had simply been more thorough about it than anyone else, and nobody had added up the total picture of what they were assembling. They had also, and this took me longer to find because it was spread across hundreds of small individual transactions, been collecting information on anomalies. Every record of an unexplained deep space phenomenon, every archived survey note that mentioned something unusual and moved on, every research paper that included a footnote about an observation that did not fit the standard models. Humans had, quietly and consistently, collected all of it. I found a pattern in their scientific conference participation that I found particularly striking. At every multi-species conference on astrophysics or deep space research over 60 years, human delegates had reliably asked questions about the outer rim. Not always the same questions, not always the same delegates, but the direction of inquiry was consistent. What do we know about the region beyond the Yesen Drift? Has any survey covered the area marked as unsurveyed in the current charts? What is the basis for the classification of that sector as empty? The other delegates at these conferences had answered these questions with the patience of people humoring someone who keeps asking about something everyone already knows is not worth talking about. The outer rim surveys were incomplete because the distances were extreme and the preliminary readings had shown nothing of scientific interest. There was no particular reason to prioritize them. Resources were better directed toward regions that showed promise. The humans had listened politely to all of this and then asked the next question. For 60 years, I found records of human engineers filing proposals with their own internal agencies, not conclave bodies, internal human research and development programs that had been summarized in the open publications as general-purpose long-range transit research, deep space life support systems, self-sustaining closed ecological cycles, propulsion designs optimized for very long journeys with no planned stopover points. All of it described in language that was technically accurate and entirely uninformative about its true purpose. They had called one project the Long Arc Initiative. It had been publicly described as a study into multi-generational deep space travel theory. The published papers from it were dense with methodology and carefully scoped in their conclusions. What the published papers did not say, and what I only understood now by looking at the full 60-year timeline of human behavior, was that the Long Arc Initiative was not theoretical at all. It was a construction plan. I sat in my workspace one evening about 10 days into this research, staring at the timeline I had assembled on my display, and I had a thought that stopped me entirely. Every time a human diplomat had been described as eccentric or unpredictable, every time a human engineer had filed a project proposal that seemed slightly off topic, every time a human researcher had asked questions at a conference that no one else seemed interested in, every single one of those moments had been categorized in our records as evidence of human strangeness, of their famous unpredictability, their unusual way of engaging with the galaxy around them. None of it had been strange. All of it had been pointed in exactly the same direction. For 60 years, while the conclave had been watching humans and concluding that they were interesting but difficult, and probably not as sophisticated as they sometimes appeared, humans had been building something. Not with urgency, not with the kind of energy that might have attracted attention, with the slow, patient, deliberate investment of a civilization that had decided what it wanted and was willing to work toward it for as long as it took. I thought of the data chip on the chair in Port Caro, the coordinates, the direction they pointed. I thought of Owen Lyle standing in that corridor, looking at the white space on the map and saying, "Does it not make you wonder what is out there?" He had not been making conversation. He had been telling me. I pulled up the archived list of every human who had ever participated in any kind of scientific, diplomatic, or cultural exchange with the conclave over the past 60 years. It was a very long list. I looked at it for a long time. Then I started checking birthplaces, professional histories, last known locations, cross-referenced against the human colony population records we had on file, which now showed as the last recorded census before the silence. I found what I was not sure I had been expecting to find, but which, once I found it, seemed inevitable. Owen Lyle, mid-level stellar cartographer, participant in one joint research symposium, last recorded location Ardennes, had not appeared in any conclave record after the symposium year. I had assumed he had simply returned to human space and continued his career there, as most specialists did after a conference. But his name appeared in a different database, an internal human research publication from 11 years after the symposium, a paper on deep space navigational anomalies, co-authored by 17 researchers, buried in the Human Science Archives under a classification that translated roughly as ongoing internal study. The paper's primary subject was a region of space at the outer edge of the galactic rim. The coordinates in the paper's survey data matched the coordinates on the data chip I had found in Port Caro. Owen Lyle had been looking for this place, or something in this direction, for at least 11 years before I met him in that corridor. He had been asking about it in public, in conference rooms full of other species, using the normal channels of scientific inquiry. He had been asking in plain sight. And the conclave had found his questions mildly beside the point and moved on. I closed the paper. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The Velkar liked to say that there are two kinds of intelligence in the galaxy, the kind that watches and the kind that moves. They considered themselves watchers, which they considered superior. They had always regarded humans as movers, restless, impatient, unable to simply observe without interfering. I was beginning to think that this division was wrong, or rather, that humans had always been both, that the watching and the moving had been happening at the same time, in the same people, at the same quiet and relentless pace, for longer than any of us had thought to look for it. 60 years of watching, and then they moved. The formal conclave inquiry into the human absence had by this point grown into a significant institutional process. 5 separate committees had been convened. Dozens of delegations had filed formal statements. A subcommittee on emergency diplomatic protocols had met 3 times. There had been long procedural debates about whether the human member seat should be temporarily held or formally suspended, a question that generated more discussion than anything else, because it touched on issues of precedent and political pride in ways that the actual practical question of where 40 million humans had gone somehow did not. I filed my research findings into the inquiry system carefully and thoroughly. I documented the trading routes, the archive access patterns, the conference question histories, the engineering projects, the Long Arc initiative, the coordinates on the data chip, all of it. I used precise language and attached every supporting record I had found. The inquiry committee read my report and formally thanked me for my thoroughness. Then they asked whether I had any evidence of a security threat. I said no. I had no evidence of a security threat. They nodded. They filed the report under ongoing investigation and moved to the next agenda item. I walked out of that meeting and stood in the corridor for a moment, alone, with the particular feeling of someone who has just been politely not heard. Then I went back to my workspace and opened the coordinates again. Sessa found me there an hour later. She looked at my screen, and then at me, and said nothing for a moment. Then she sat down across from me. "You are going to go," she said. It was not a question. "I have to see," I said. "The committee did not assign this to you." "No," I agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "What do you expect to find?" I looked at the coordinates. "I expect to find whatever humans found 60 years ago, when they first looked in this direction," I said. "I expect to find why they spent 60 years preparing to go there." I paused. "I expect to find whatever it was that made them decide this galaxy was not where they wanted to stay." Sessa looked at the coordinates for a long time. Then she said something that I did not expect from a person who had spent 30 years being careful and precise and procedurally correct. She said, "I am coming with you." I looked at her. "I am old," she said simply, "and I have spent 30 years watching interesting things from a distance and writing careful reports about them. I think I would like, for once, to be closer." I nodded. I began making the arrangements. We would need a ship. We would need supplies for a journey of uncertain duration to a destination that did not appear on any official chart. We would need authorization, which I decided to request formally, and which I fully expected to take longer to receive than I had patience for, but which turned out to be granted within 2 days because the committee, having done nothing with my report, apparently felt that sending 2 observers to follow up on the coordinates was a reasonable action that could be logged as a response without requiring them to make any difficult decisions. And so, 11 days after my research had uncovered 60 years of human preparation and quiet intention, I was sitting in the cockpit of a small long-range survey vessel with Sessa beside me and Kel in the navigation seat, watching the familiar stars of conclave space drop away behind us as we pointed toward the coordinate string on the data chip and the white space at the edge of the map. Preth had declined to come. He had a family. I understood. Dava had asked to come and been told her expertise was needed for continued analysis at Central Station, which was true, and also a polite way of limiting the size of our unauthorized expedition. She gave me copies of all her research before we left, packed into a data unit she pressed into my hands at the docking bay, with an expression that mixed envy and worry in about equal measure. As the station fell away behind us, and the shipping lanes thinned, and the traffic of ordinary galactic life faded from our sensors, I pulled up the last piece of information I had found in my research. Something I had come across near the end, almost by accident, buried in a public cultural archive entry that had been filed as general interest documentation. It was a record of a human saying, old, according to the archive notation, predating human involvement in the conclave by several centuries, apparently common enough in human culture that it had been recorded as a proverb rather than a specific quotation. It read, "Not all those who wander are lost." I read it twice. Then I set it aside and watched the stars ahead of us, the unfamiliar ones at the rim where the charts grew thin, and the notations grew vague, and the surveys ran out, and humans had found something worth 60 years of patient, quiet, relentless preparation. I thought I was beginning to understand them. I was not sure I would understand what we were going to find. The stars changed at the rim. That is the only way I can describe it, even now, even having thought about it for a long time, and tried to find more precise language. The stars changed. Out in the deep territory beyond the last conclave survey markers, where our charts showed nothing but vague notation, and old telescope data gathered from too great a distance to be specific, the distribution of stars was different from what we were used to. Sparser in some directions, thicker in others, colors that were subtly shifted. The galaxy looked different from here, and the difference was not in the galaxy. The difference was in the perspective. We had been traveling for 19 days when Kel said quietly, from the navigation seat, "Something is on sensors." He did not say it with urgency. He said it the way he always announced things, carefully, factually, without adding interpretation before the facts were in. It was one of the things I valued most about him. I moved to the sensor station and looked. Something was there. At first it read as a gravitational anomaly, the kind of reading that usually means a mass concentration, a large celestial body, a dense cluster of stellar material. But the shape of the reading was wrong for any of those explanations. The gravitational signature was too regular, too symmetrical. Natural mass concentrations are not symmetrical. They have the rough irregularity of things that formed through accumulation and collision over billions of years. This was not rough or irregular. "Slow us down," I said. Kel adjusted our approach velocity without comment. Sessa had come forward from her seat and was looking at the readings over my shoulder. For 4 hours we approached slowly, while the sensor picture grew more detailed and more impossible. The structure, because that was what it was, the readings became unmistakable as a structure, was enormous. My instruments had difficulty with the scale at first, because there was nothing nearby to compare it to. Eventually Kel calibrated the readings against the stellar background and gave me a number. It was larger than any object constructed by any member civilization of the conclave. It was larger, by a significant degree, than anything I had ever read about in the technical literature of any species. It was larger than some of the moons in systems I knew. It was a structure, built by some intelligence, and it was so large that my instruments had initially mistaken it for a celestial feature. It was dark, mostly. Not entirely. Certain sections showed faint luminescence, deep, slow pulses of something between light and not light that my instruments registered but could not classify. The overall form was difficult for my eyes to resolve into a shape that meant anything. It was not built for beings who perceive the way I do. Every angle of it seemed to suggest a geometry that my mind kept sliding away from. I could see the human ships. They were small against it. Everything was small against it, but unmistakably human in their design. Dozens of them. No, as my sensors improved their resolution at closer range. Not dozens, hundreds. The human fleet that I had expected to be at least somewhat impressive given 60 years of preparation was, in fact, breathtaking. Long ships, wide ships, vessels of a scale I had not known humans were capable of building, all of them arranged in a broad formation near one section of the structure that showed a concentration of the slow pulsing light. They were not moving, they were simply there, parked in formation, in the presence of something ancient and vast and impossible. I realized I was not breathing normally, and made a deliberate effort to correct that. "It is not ours," Sessa said. She meant it was not the product of any known civilization. She meant it had been here before the conclave, before the member species, possibly before everything we would call recorded galactic history. She said it very quietly, as a statement of the obvious. No, I said. It is not. We moved closer still. Kel tracked our progress against the human vessel formation and brought us to a point outside their perimeter, but within visual sensor range of the section that was lit. I was watching the screens carefully. The human ships were not broadcasting on any public channel. No conclave frequencies, no standard beacon signals. But they were active. I could see the heat signatures of powered systems, the electromagnetic indicators of working equipment. They had not been here for years. From the readings, they had been here for weeks, perhaps a month. Then, from a frequency I almost missed because it was not one I habitually monitored, came a signal. Single channel, human origin, addressed, specifically, to conclave survey vessel designations. Addressed to us. Sessa and I looked at each other. Kel opened the channel. The voice that came through was a woman's voice, clear and unhurried, with the particular accent of someone who had grown up in the outer colony systems. She said, "Conclave vessel, we have been tracking your approach since you crossed the rim boundary. You are welcome here. Please continue on your current heading and match position with the vessel marked on the channel you are now receiving. Someone will meet you." The channel closed. A navigation marker appeared on our displays, a human ship near the lit section of the structure, slightly separated from the main formation. I looked at Sessa. She looked at me. "Well," she said. We followed the marker. The ship we matched position with was a human long-range vessel, mid-sized, built for extended travel. As we brought our survey craft alongside it, a docking connection was extended. Standard universal port. Humans had always insisted on universal docking compatibility, which the conclave engineering committees had found unnecessarily idealistic and had noted in their reports as characteristic of human optimism about cross-species cooperation. I thought about that note now and felt something I could not cleanly label. We crossed through the docking connection and into the human ship. The interior was warm and lit with the particular quality of light humans preferred, slightly warmer in tone than the standard conclave spectrum, a little softer. The corridor we entered was clean and functional, and smelled faintly of something I could not identify, but which my translation unit flagged as probably organic and probably pleasant by human standards. There was a woman waiting for us. She was not young. Her hair was entirely white and pulled back from her face simply, and she stood with the straightness of someone who had spent a long professional career standing precisely that way. She was looking at us with an expression I needed a moment to interpret. Not unfriendly, not entirely warm, somewhere in the range of settled and watchful that reminded me, oddly, of Sessa. "I am Dr. Clara Holt," she said. Her voice matched the one from the channel. "Coordinator of the Long Arc Initiative, 3rd generation." She paused. "You are the first conclave observers to make it here. We did not expect it to take this long." "We had difficulty seeing the pattern," I said. It was the most honest thing I could say. She nodded, not surprised. "Would you like to understand what this is?" she said, and gestured toward the structure visible through the ship's main viewport, its slow light pulsing in the dark. "Yes," I said, "very much." She turned and began walking, and we followed her. As we walked, she talked, in the straightforward manner of someone explaining something they have explained many times and have stopped feeling the need to simplify. She said the structure had been detected by human deep space instruments 63 years ago. An anomalous reading from an early long-range telescope, exactly the kind of small, easy-to-dismiss reading that gets cataloged and filed under further study required, and then not further studied. A human researcher named Owen Lyle had flagged it in the data archives and refused to let it drop. I stopped walking. Clara Holt turned to look at me. "Owen Lyle," I said. "Stellar cartographer." She seemed slightly surprised. "You know the name?" "We met once," I said. "A symposium, a long time ago." She studied me for a moment. "He died 9 years ago," she said quietly. "He spent 40 years on this work. He knew he would probably not live to see us arrive. He arranged for his daughter to be part of the final crew." I did not say anything. I stood in the corridor of a human ship at the edge of the galaxy, looking through a viewport at something that should not exist and did, and I thought about a man in a corridor looking at blank space on a map and asking me if it did not make me wonder what was out there. He had already known what was out there. He had just wanted to know if I could see it too. He had been asking us. All of them had been asking, in their conferences and their research papers and their questions at the edges of sessions about things everyone assumed were beside the point. They had been asking whether anyone else could see the thing they had been looking at. No one had answered yes, and so they had stopped asking. Clara Holt waited for me to be ready to continue walking. She was patient. When I began moving again, she fell into step beside me and continued explaining. The structure, she said, was pre-galactic, built by something that existed before any currently living civilization, perhaps before the first stars in this galaxy had formed. It was not dangerous. They had been studying it for weeks, and every analysis confirmed it was inert in every harmful sense. What it was not inert to was intent. When human ships had approached it in formation, the lit sections had expanded. When instruments had been directed at specific features, those features had responded by becoming more visible, more accessible to analysis. It wanted to be understood. "And what is it?" Sessa said from beside me. She had been silent for a long time. Clara Holt stopped at a doorway and opened it. Beyond it was an observation room with a direct, unobstructed view of the structure's lit section. In that light, slow, deep, unhurried, the geometry of it resolved slightly. Not completely, but enough. "We call it a gate," Clara Holt said, "though that is imprecise. It is more accurate to say it is an invitation." She looked at it with the expression of someone who has stood in front of a very large thing many times and still has not fully absorbed it. Something built it and then left, and the act of building it and leaving was itself a message. A question, really. She was quiet for a moment. "Can you find this? And if you find it, will you come?" The room was silent, except for the faint electrical hum of the ship's systems. "Humans found it," I said. "Humans found it," she agreed. I looked at the gate, the invitation, the question, the thing built before memory by something that expected someone to come looking, and I felt the full weight of 60 years pressing on me. 60 years of questions asked in conference rooms that no one heard. 60 years of supply lines laid down like stitches across empty space. 60 years of patient, committed work towards something that the rest of the galaxy had not known to look for. "When will you go through?" Sessa asked. "We have already sent the first ships," Clara Holt said simply. 3 weeks ago, they confirmed it is passable. We have been waiting, coordinating our main fleet departure, making sure everyone who wanted to come was here." She paused. "We depart in 4 days." 4 days. I stood at that viewport for a long time. No one spoke. The gate pulsed its slow, ancient light. Then I found it. There, on the interior wall of the observation room, half behind a support strut, scratched into the surface, deeply enough to be permanent, but carefully enough to be legible, scratched in dozens of languages. I could see Velkar script, Drovan notation, Pahrin symbol form, Kethali trade glyphs, and at least a dozen others, with the same message written in each one. "You could have come with us." I stood and read it in my own language and then read it again. It was not arrogance. Standing here now, in this room, with the gate pulsing outside and the weight of 60 years finally making complete sense, I understood exactly what it was. It was an apology, and it was an invitation, and it was an honest admission of grief. They had wanted company. They had been asking for it for 60 years, in every way they knew how to ask. They had asked in symposium rooms and treaty sessions and cultural exchanges. They had asked by being loud and unusual, and always pointing in the same direction. And when no one had answered, they had written it here, in every language they knew, so that whoever came after would understand that the door had never been closed. "You could have come. You still can." 4 days. I sent a transmission to Conclave Central Station that night. It was a long message, longer than any report I had ever filed. I described the gate, the structure, the human fleet, Clara Holt, Owen Lyle, the scratched wall, all of it. I used the clearest language I knew, and I did not manage my words for political comfort. I said what I had seen. I said what it meant. Then I sat in the small cabin I had been given on Clara Holt's ship, and looked at the coordinates I had typed out from the data chip, still sitting in my translation unit's memory, and I thought about 4 days. The conclave's response came 12 hours later. It was formal. It thanked me for my detailed report. It informed me that several committees would be convened to review the information. It requested that I remain on site and continue to gather data as long as safely possible, and that I refrain from making any decisions that might be construed as representing the conclave's position on the matter of the gate or the human fleet's intended transit. I read the response twice. I thought about committees. I thought about 60 years of questions going unanswered, while committees decided whether the questions were worth hearing. I went to find Clara Holt. She was in what she called the archive room, a space filled with data storage systems and also, oddly, with physical paper documents, human handwriting on actual paper, stacked and stored with care. I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at them. "What are those?" I asked. "Journals," she said. "From every person who worked on the Long Arc Initiative. We kept them by hand because some things, humans feel, should be written rather than typed." She looked at the stacks with evident feeling. "Owen Lyles are in that section. His daughter carried his last notebooks here herself." I sat down across from her. "I want to ask you something," I said. "You want to ask if you can come with us?" she said. I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. She looked at me steadily. "Can you speak for your government?" "No," I said. "I cannot. The conclave will take time to decide, and the time they take will be longer than 4 days." "I know," she said. There was no criticism in it. She said it the way you say something you have understood for a long time. We spent 60 years knowing that. "I am asking as myself," I said, "not as a representative. As a person who has been looking at this for 19 days, and is now looking at a wall with a message on it, and is not interested in waiting for a committee." Clara Holt was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is there anyone who would come with you from your vessel?" I thought of Sessa, who had said she wanted to be closer to things for once. I thought of Kell, who never spoke more than the situation required, and who I suspected was braver than he ever showed. "Yes," I said. "I believe there is." She nodded slowly. "Then here is what I will tell you," she said. "We are not closing the gate behind us. Whatever is on the other side, and we know some of it, the first 3 ships came back to report before the main passage. It is not a door that locks. The invitation does not expire." She paused. "The conclave can come when it is ready. Any civilization can. That is the point of a gate." "But you are not waiting," I said. "We waited 60 years," she said simply, "for someone to hear us." The silence between us was the kind that does not need filling. "We will be ready to receive you and your crew as passengers if you choose to come," she said. "But I will not tell you what to choose. That is not something I am willing to do." She almost smiled. "We learned a long time ago not to tell other people what they should want to look at." I stood up. I looked at the stacks of handwritten journals, at Owen Lyle's notebooks in their section, at the work of a man who had spent his life pointing at something and asking whether anyone else could see it. I went to find Sessa and Kell. Sessa was in the observation room, standing at the viewport, looking at the gate. She did not turn when I came in. She said, without preamble, "We are staying." "Yes," I said. "What do we tell Central Station?" "I already told them everything," I said. "I told them what is here, what it is, what it does, and where it goes. I told them the humans leave in 4 days, and I told them the gate stays open." I paused. "What they do with that is their decision." She turned to look at me then. "And ours?" I looked at the gate. Its light was slow and deep and extraordinarily patient. "Ours is already made," I said. Kell, at his station, had been listening. He said, with the same quiet practicality he brought to everything, "I will begin preparing our equipment for transfer to the human vessel." I nodded at him. "Thank you, Kell." He began moving. Sessa turned back to the viewport. I stood beside her, and we looked at the gate together in silence for a while. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said after a while. "What?" "The meal," she said. "The meal in Port Caro. The 4 plates on the table." I thought about it. 4 plates, arranged properly, food that had taken hours to prepare. Someone made a last meal, she said, and sat down and ate it, and then got up and left. She was quiet for a moment. That requires a very specific kind of peace with a decision. Yes, I said. I think I understand them better now, she said. I think I do too, I said. The gate pulsed. Outside, the human fleet was steady and vast in the dark, 4 days from the largest step any civilization in this galaxy had ever taken. Inside, in a room on a human ship, 2 Sethi observers stood at a window and thought about open channels, empty chairs, 60 years of quiet preparation, a man who had spent his life pointing at empty space, a wall with a message in every language, and the particular quality of a silence that does not mean absence. It means decision. I had spent my career learning to notice small things. The thing I was noticing now was this: the gate was open. It had been built to stay open. Whatever had built it had understood something about the nature of readiness, that not everyone reaches it at the same time, that the answer to an invitation is not always immediate, that the kindest thing you can offer a person who is not yet ready is a door that remains unlocked. You could have come with us. The 3 of us, one veteran observer who had spent 30 years watching from a careful distance, one junior officer who had never had the chance to be anything other than quietly capable, and myself, a mid-rank diplomat who had made a career of noticing small things and was now standing in front of the largest thing I had ever seen, spent our last night in the observation room, looking out at the gate, not talking very much. In the morning, I sent one final transmission to Central Station. Not a report, not a filing, just a message. It said, "The gate is open. The humans left the coordinates. The invitation does not expire. When you are ready, you will know where to look." And I gave the coordinates. All of them. Clearly and precisely, the way Owen Lyle would have wanted them given, in language that required no committee to interpret. Then I signed my name, which is Oren, and I closed the channel, and I went to help Kel finish packing. 4 days later, I went through the gate. What is on the other side is a story for another time. What I can tell you, sitting here now with the gate behind me, and something unimaginable ahead, is that the humans were right. Not about everything. No one is right about everything, but they were right about this. Right that the blank space at the edge of the map was not empty. Right that the questions no one else wanted to ask were the most important ones. Right that 60 years of patience in the direction of something true is not stubbornness. It is faith. And they were right to write that message on the wall. Because I came. And perhaps, in time, others will too. The door is still open. The invitation does not expire. All you have to do is wonder what is out there, and then go find out.